I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be invited, and I'm really excited to share the case study of City of Mississauga and what we did there with improving our stormwater system funding and how we did that. Next slide, please, Mary. So just to orient everyone, so Mississauga is a city in the province of Ontario. It's a relatively large city, so over 800,000 people by now. We have about 22 kilometers of shoreline on Lake Ontario, which is one of Canada's Great Lakes and part of the largest freshwater system in the world. A lot of parks, we have woodlands, green spaces throughout the city. And in general, it's quite a developed city, pretty built out. It was built over a relatively rapid period of time, about 30 to 50 years ago. So pretty built out, not a lot of new development, but quite a bit of retrofitting and infill development. Next slide, please. So for Mississauga, really our journey to implementing a stormwater charge began in 2012 when we commissioned a stormwater feasibility study, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, to determine what the best way was for us to fund our stormwater system. We knew we had shortfalls in funding, we knew we had needs, but we needed to determine what the best way was forward. There are several different options to fund stormwater systems beyond just user fees, and so we wanted to look at that and be presented with options. Now, we knew what the pressures were that were facing our stormwater system. So the big reason that we really looked to move towards a user fee model was because of flood management. We were certainly prone to both riverine flooding as well as urban flooding, and that was a really big issue for us. We also knew that we were going to have to implement some really big infrastructure projects to deal with that flooding, and we also knew that because Mississauga was built out at a relatively short period of time, that all of our infrastructure was aging at the same time. It was going to need renewal within a relatively short period of time. We had those ongoing operations and maintenance pressures, and that also included monitoring and enforcing our spills bylaw. And we also knew that we were experiencing more extreme storm events and flooding, and that we would continue to experience these, and this is something that we would have to prepare for. Next slide, please. So what was the rationale for us to implement a stormwater user fee? So first off, it was a more fair distribution of cost among different types of properties. And fairness was really one of the guiding principles that we adopted in implementing the user fee. So previously, our stormwater system was funded through property taxes, which is based on the value of the property, but isn't really very indicative of the amount of pressure that a property places on the stormwater system. We changed to a system, which I'll explain in a little bit, that was based more on impervious surface. So you can see here on the left, prior to that, when we were still funded through property taxes, the majority of funding came through residential properties, which are the majority by number of properties in Mississauga. However, those industrial and commercial and institutional properties, while they're the minority of properties by number, they're actually the majority of hard surface in Mississauga. So once we changed to a user fee model, there was a more fair redistribution of who pays. Next slide, please. One of our big desires was to also increase the amount of funding that we had. And so prior to the stormwater charge being implemented, we would be allocated anywhere from about $6 to $16 million Canadian a year to support our stormwater system, both in capital and operating costs. The first year that we implemented the charge, this went up to $32 million. So really significant difference, and ultimately pretty transformative in what we were able to achieve. That said, some municipalities that I know have maintained more of a revenue neutral approach, which can be an option too. Another big reason for us to implement this was to have a dedicated budget. So we have a stormwater rate that is reviewed annually as part of the city's budget process. It's subject to public debate, and council, our elected officials, our councillors and mayor, all debated as well too, just like they do the general budget. But we know that we have a dedicated amount that we can count on from year to year, which allows us to plan more sustainably. Next slide, please. So the process that we went through, I mentioned the stormwater feasibility study, and that's really a big first step that most Canadian municipalities undertake before they switch to a user fee structure. It can be relatively basic or much more detailed, but typically it will estimate what your shortfall is, provide a recommended approach, in this case, user fees to pay for that, and may even delve into some of the analysis that will inform your rate. I mentioned some of our guiding principles, and so this was something that we really always try to adhere to. Transparency, and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like, fairness, and also consistency, so applying the same process to all types of properties. We also struck an advisory committee composed of different stakeholders and major property owners to help guide us as we brought different parts of the user fee program to them, and we're able to sort of adjust that in an iterative way. We had public information centers to get feedback from the public, and we also assessed the resources we had in place when it came to staff, when it came to managing property-related data, when it came to billing, in order to determine what we had in place and what we would need, both to develop the charge, but also to operate it on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. A really important piece in developing our user fee was building internal consensus. So, we needed buy-in from our councillors and our mayor, as well as other municipal staff as well too. This was a very cross-divisional project that involved a lot of different teams, not just the stormwater team. So there's some different ways we did this, and a lot of this is how you frame the issue and frame the need for a user fee. So obviously I had mentioned some of the pressures that Mississauga was facing, and this provided a really good opportunity to address these in the long term. It also provided us, while we weren't the first municipality in Canada to adopt a user fee system, we definitely did have a very publicized one, and it was relatively sophisticated in how it was approached. And so it really allowed us to position this as us taking a position of municipal leadership when it came to other cities in Canada. At the same time, it is a proven funding solution that we've seen in Canada and also in the United States. So you're still walking a path that has been walked by many other towns and cities. And it was very helpful to find a council champion. So in this case, it was our mayor at the time who heard about this happening in another municipality and wanted to know why we weren't doing it. And so it was really great to have someone on council who could speak to the councillors and elected officials and to help pave the way. Next slide, please. So the model that we chose is the single family unit model. And so what this, the way this is approached is we did a statistical sampling of 2,000 residential or single family properties in Mississauga, various different kinds. So detached homes, semi-detached homes, freehold townhouses, to determine the average amount of hard surface on the average residential property in Mississauga. And this amount of hard surface is called one single family unit, or SFU, of hard surface. And so for the way essentially that we would determine it, and I'll determine the charge for property, and I'll show you what that looks like for both residential and non-residential properties in a moment, is we would assess each property, how many SFUs or billing units, if you will, of hard surface are on that property. We would multiply it by the stormwater rate, for that particular year, and then you would get your stormwater charge for that property. And then I'll show you what that looks like for different types of properties. So for residential properties, we based the amount of hard surface expected to be seen on a property on roof area. And that's for two different reasons. We found while we were doing this analysis that there was a very good correlation, at least in Mississauga, between total roof area on a property and total hard surface. So, including also the driveways, the pathways, all of that. And also roof area was something that the city already mapped. And so this helped us to be a bit more efficient, reduce some of the administration. So based on roof area, we determined the amount of billing units or SFUs of hard surface on a residential property. And residential properties were slotted into one of 5 tiers, ranging from the very smallest all the way to the very largest with the most roof area. And these charges that you see were from, I believe, last year, and this is an annual charge. So the very largest or highest roof area properties, which was really only, I think, the top 5% of residential properties, were charged a total of just over $180 per year for their stormwater charge. Next slide, please. Now, for those non-residential properties, for industrial and commercial and institutional properties, that roof area to hard surface ratio didn't really hold up. And so for each of these properties, we would map the total impervious area on each of them, and then we would divide that by the amount of square meters found in 1 billing unit or SFU of hard surface. Now, so this was a much more individualized approach, but if you'll recall, these properties, while they're the minority of properties in Mississauga, have the majority of hard surface. So this is really worth that administration and that extra work to get it right. And we had one assessment for each property, even if it was a condominium with maybe multiple units or an industrial property with multiple units, only one assessment per property. Next slide, please. So what did the billing look like? As Mary mentioned, it looked very similar to what you would see on your water wastewater bill. And in fact, we worked with the region of Peel, which is sort of a different level of government who manages water wastewater, to have it appear on their bill. So you would see, if you were a resident in Mississauga, you would see one line for your water charges for the month. You would see, or for the quarter, if you're residential, you would see one line for your wastewater charges, and then you would see one line for your stormwater charges. So the majority of properties receive their bill on a quarterly basis, with those really high water users receiving them on a monthly basis. And then, as I mentioned, when you have sometimes maybe a property where there might be multiple units that have separate water bills, you would still only have one stormwater bill for that property, and then it would be up to the property owner or the property manager to divide that up appropriately. Next slide, please. So a few different considerations that we needed to keep in mind, and some of these are lessons learned as well too. So some of these didn't become apparent until we really started implementing our stormwater charge. So like I said, you really want to think about the resources, the staff resources, the data management resources that you have available, both for implementation, but also for that ongoing operation. Some towns and cities that have implemented stormwater user fees have an upper limit for charges where they won't go above a certain amount. We chose not to. So there are indeed some very, very large, hard surface heavy properties in Mississauga that have stormwater charges going into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There will always be some kind of a cutoff, and someone will always be on the wrong side of it or perceived wrong side of it. So for example, I mentioned the residential tiered system, and without fail, you will have some residential properties that are 0.1 square meters over into the next larger tier. And we did have an appeal process, so that's something to consider as well too. But If upon reviewing the property, you are still 0.1 square meters into that next tier, you know, that's where the consistency piece came in, and we were always consistent, never bumping up or down. And that's something else to remember as well too, is that it's really helpful to limit staff and elected official discretion in how individual properties are assessed to keep that fairness and transparency. And something else to think about as well too, which we did implement, was compassionate relief subsidies for certain types of properties. For example, low-income seniors, perhaps nonprofit organizations. We didn't implement that one, but we did implement for places of worship as well too, and agricultural properties, a subsidy in recognition of some of the financial pressures that they face. Next slide, please. We also implemented various outreach tools for the launch of the stormwater charge. So I'd mentioned our advisory committees. We had a variety of web resources. We did in-person engagement. This was obviously all pre-COVID. We did mail outs to every property in Mississauga. But we also had, and this was really useful, an online stormwater charge estimator, where you could type in your address and you could see what your annual stormwater charge would be. You would see the mapped aerial imagery that we used. And so that helped, I think, people to sort of avoid some surprises. But you could also type in, let's say, your next door neighbor's address. You could type in the address of the mall down the street. And so in this particular case, certainly, you know, sometimes we got phone calls from people who were asking why they were paying more than their next door neighbor. But at the same time, this was really part of our transparency approach, where we really wanted to be open about what our stormwater charge was and how it is calculated. Next slide, please. And for us, you know, our stormwater system and stormwater management in some ways is sort of a silent but essential service. And people don't really notice your stormwater system until it doesn't work and they're flooded, or there's a spill, or some really negative event. Now, with launching our stormwater charge, we suddenly did have a lot of public attention on stormwater management. And so we wanted to use this to help to educate the public on stormwater management overall and how it helps to protect their property, even what our stormwater system is. For us, we found there was actually a lot of confusion between what our wastewater system is versus stormwater. So we engaged in a lot of different approaches to educate the public on stormwater management. And frankly, this is a whole other presentation that I could do, so I won't get too deeply into it, but we did try to tailor different approaches to different audiences. Mississauga is a very multicultural city, and so we tried to utilize some of the language skills of our staff to reach out to different communities. We also tried, something we were really excited about is we tried to engage people in the stormwater system based on, you know, things that they enjoy, like public art. So we had a public art event where artists did an art performance and turned stormwater infrastructure into art over the course of the day. Next slide, please. Now, something that people often ask about are incentives and credit programs for incentivizing best management practices on private properties. And stormwater charges can be a vehicle for this. Looking particularly at industrial and commercial and institutional properties, again, those really big hard surface properties, stormwater credits are usually the most common type of incentive. It can be, you know, an incentive for property owners to lower their stormwater charge. It's also, I would say, quite important to consider both from whether people adopt it or not, or utilize it or not, that you have given them an option to lower their stormwater charge, and it can also help you avoid legal challenges down the road too. Next slide, please. So Mississauga's stormwater credit program is based on 4 different categories. Different best management practices fall into different categories, and you get up to a maximum of a certain percentage in each category. Some best management practices might fall into more than one category, so you are allowed to double dip, if you will. But the total credit that you can receive is 50% off your stormwater charge. And again, this is for those institutional, commercial, industrial properties. Next slide, please. So we learned a lot of lessons from the implementation of our credit program. So they are very important to offer, again, so that there is at least an option for those properties with the really high stormwater charges to decrease their charge. At the same time, we found, and I know many other Canadian cities have also found this, that sometimes credit programs have relatively low uptake. We found that uptake tended to be more from existing best management practices on properties that had already implemented them. And this is not necessarily surprising because, you know, property owners won't necessarily rip up a perfectly good asphalt parking lot and turn it into permeable pavement right off the bat. But the hope is, as they are retrofitting over time, that this will be an option that they're going to consider when the opportunity arises. That said, we do find that those property owners do need a lot of support when it comes to guidance, when it comes to understanding options, in order to surmount some of the barriers to implementing best management practices and getting into that credit process. Next slide, please. So in recognition of this, Mississauga is currently looking at a lot of different options now for their credit program. And so this is still very much in the development phase, but it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. One thing that they're looking at is the option to share credits among multiple properties using communal best management practices, recognizing that, you know, one property might have more space for a certain best management practice and other properties might be able to drain into it. So that's something that they're looking at. They're looking at a sliding scale of credits based on geographical locations. And it could be, you know, they might determine it based on, you know, the age of the development or the location in the watershed or other factors. They're looking at maybe having more flexibility in those different credit categories. And also looking at market-based incentives too. So getting those vendors and those contractors and consultants that would typically implement different best management practices, or that would typically maybe implement retrofits that don't have much to do with stormwater management, and educate them and maybe give them incentives to market those stormwater best management practices to their clients. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to residential properties, you'll find less credit programs in Canada. Certainly the advantages of having a residential credit program is to increase recognition of the best practices that are out there, to engage homeowners and to reward them for when they have done good work, and also to mitigate complaints from the residential sector for not having that same option to reduce their stormwater charge. On the downside, residential credit programs tend to have relatively high administration costs, both initial costs and then on an ongoing basis. If somebody is paying $100 a year for the stormwater charge, you know, is it worthwhile to go out every year to see if they've put their rain barrel back out in the spring? The credit amounts tend to be relatively low, especially in comparison with that charge amount. Again, if you're, you know, charged $100 a year, are you going to spend $50 on a, you know, a rain barrel? Usually people will implement those best practices on a residential property for other reasons. And they often need quite a bit of guidance as well. What I will say is that while residential credit programs, some have been implemented in Canada, but if not implemented, it is still important to offer a proactive approach to recognizing residential properties that have implemented best practices and have done good work. So next slide, please, and I'll show you what we did to encourage some of ours. We implemented a stormwater home visit pilot program where we hired stormwater advisors to go to residential properties at the property owner's request, give them sort of an assessment of what they could do on their property both to manage stormwater and just regarding environmental sustainability in general. And then if desired, they could also get a free rain barrel. And we got great uptake. For that, we had spaces for 120 properties, and registration filled up within 36 hours of us opening it up. And we did a survey afterwards and found that about 20% of properties had implemented at least one of the recommended measures within 2 weeks of their assessment. Next slide, please. So just to finish up, what do some of these outcomes from implementing a user fee for Mississauga look like? So as I mentioned, our initial motivation was really quantity control and flooding. And so since the implementation of the stormwater charge, we've been able to implement some really significant stormwater quantity control infrastructure that includes various underground storage galleries. We've done a lot of sediment removal from stormwater management ponds, extending their lives, and we've undertaken environmental assessments for major capital projects related to riverine flooding. We've also increased our focus on low impact development. So bioswales, rain gardens, permeable pavement, and those kinds of options as well too. And have also implemented a pipe renewal reserve, knowing again that our storm sewers are all aging at about the same time. We began with very modest deposits into the pipe renewal reserve, and it's currently valued at about 30 million this year. Next slide, please. But one of the great things too about implementing the user fee is that it allowed us to increasingly focus on water quality and also on asset management as well too. So Mississauga is nearing completion of a stormwater asset management planning process. This is required now through provincial legislation, but at the same time, its funding has allowed us to really do a good job of that. Mississauga also hired storm sewer bylaw enforcement officer, was able to escalate education and enforcement when it came to water quality at industrial properties. And the city is also developing a stormwater master plan as well too.